Where this dispute is really going to have, and is already having, an enormous impact is in the fairly tight competition for large light water reactors. When you look at competitive, let's say, Western markets, you're basically talking about three vendors for the large reactors. We're talking about Westinghouse, the Koreans, and the French with EDF. The French are in the room, but very few people think they have a commercial chance to actually sell those reactors, which brings it down, therefore, to Westinghouse or the Koreans. And what Westinghouse is trying to do with these lawsuits is come to some settlement, but also effectively block Korean exports of their large reactor technologies anywhere. So it's fairly high stakes, and then the stakes get even higher when you think of geostrategically important places like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, these markets where these vendors we've been talking about are also competing against Chinese vendors and Russian vendors. And in those places, Westinghouse blocking the Koreans could potentially have the impact of the reactor deal, if it goes forward, going to China or to Russia. So there are big geopolitical stakes to what is going on with what is otherwise a fairly in the weeds IP and export control dispute.
Welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by first-time guest, Phil Chaffee. Phil, this has been a long time coming. You are the editor of Nuclear Intelligencer and the bureau chief. That all sounds so badass, but you're the bureau chief of Energy Intelligence's New York offices. I see you at a lot of conferences, locally here in Canada, internationally. You're part of an intelligence bureau. You have this kind of international man of mystery mystique about you. For the longest time, I thought you were British. I have no idea why. I'm going to give you the opportunity to, clarify a few things and expand on my bare bones introduction there. But Phil, I've spoken with a few folks about having you on, and they're very excited to have you here. So thank you for being a first-time decoupler, and looking forward to diving into the issues at hand today. But first off, who the hell are you?
Well, thanks for having me.
If you can reveal it.
Yeah, I can disclose my name, and I'm Phil Chaffee. The actual name of the publication I edit is Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, which launched in 2007. It was originally called Uranium Intelligence Weekly, but we are part of a suite of newsletters put out by Energy Intelligence, which largely focus on oil and gas, but also renewables, some other products. I just focus on the nuclear product, and for years I was a reporter. For the last several years, I've been the editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly. You thought I was English, possibly because for years I was based in London. I am now based in New York, where I also am the bureau chief of our bureau of reporters. But my most important job is my editor job, where I edit every week this publication that covers everything in the nuclear industry, from new builds and financing to geopolitics to the fuel cycle and uranium and enrichment, and basically, and also some of the back end stuff and repositories. Basically, most things nuclear we cover. We don't do tons on nuclear weapons and stuff, but sort of where those proliferation issues overlap with the civil nuclear industry, we do cover there. So it's we have a possibly too big a mandate, but we cover everything quite a lot, and I have almost 20 years covering this stuff.
Okay, so we were chatting for a while about what we were going to chat about, and there is fresh spat in the air between Westinghouse and the Koreans. I believe this time over the Czechia builds. And what a topic. I think we've got a lot to deep dive here. And in the context of, I think when we last saw each other, it was at COP28 in Dubai. There was the declaration of, I don't know if it got up to 30 countries, but high 20s, non-Russia, non-China, but a bunch of other countries essentially saying, all the countries that aren't really doing all that much building, we're saying we're going to triple nuclear energy by 2050. And the kind of state of affairs looking at non-Russia, non-China in terms of reactor vendors is not looking too hopeful or great. We have, Westinghouse just having delivered Vogtle 3 and 4, a little behind schedule, a little over budget. They're on the grid, thank God. They didn't end up in the same state as the summer builds. We have GE Hitachi. I mean, clearing land and digging some holes for their SMRs in my backyard here. But I believe when I was just looking up, like, what was their last constructed nuclear plant, and I think it's Lungmen in Taiwan, which was never turned on.
That sounds right.
Um,
Yeah.
we've got Framatome, EDF, working on Hinkley Point. They delivered Oikolutu. So we've got some activity by the French, but certainly not a cause for a massive amount of celebration. And not to leave out Canada, we have ACL, which still exists, but it's licensed to deploy is now in the hands of SNC or Atkins Realis. Delivered Qinshan in China, very on budget and on schedule. But again, that's 20 plus years ago now. So we're left with the Koreans, who I think are, for many, sort of seen as a credible project management team and deliverer of new reactors, as evidenced by the Baraka builds. But we're seeing this big kerfuffle now between Westinghouse. So again, in this context of so much ambition and such a kind of lack of credibility amongst Western vendors, I'll just kind of call it how I sees it. This is a major issue that the one sort of entity that's at least delivered a few reactors internationally credibly is under a pretty serious I don't know how to put it, legal patent kerfuffle, and that's about the extent of my knowledge on the situation. So, Phil, again, happy to have you jump in and help explain this a
Yeah,
bit.
I would jump in there and almost narrow the stakes because I think where where this dispute is really going to have and is already having an enormous impact is in the fairly tight competition for large light water reactors. Atkins Realis is out there with their Monarch, a large new CANDU. Um, I have seen very little of them actually marketing that outside of Ontario at this point. I think they would love to, but when you look at competitive, let's say, Western markets, um, you were basically talking about three vendors for the large reactors, so not GE Hitachi, which is basically just with their SMR at this point. And the three vendors in these Western markets, and we'll get to the sort of competitive Western, non-Western markets. But for these Western markets, we're talking about Westinghouse, the Koreans, which is actually KHMP and KEPCO. We'll get to that distinction, and the French with EDF. And the French have basically not signed a contract to sell their EPR to anyone other than themselves since 2003. So Hinkley Point, that's their reactor. Flamanville 3, that's their reactor. I'm sorry, there was the Chinese. There was two EPRs to the Chinese. And that was nearly 20 years ago. But basically, they are both. I mean, all of their projects that they have owned, the French, or they have been primarily in control of in Europe, have been absolutely disasters. So most folks out there who are sort of competitively tendering for large reactors, the French are in the room, but very few people think they have a commercial chance to actually sell those reactors, which brings it down, therefore, to Westinghouse or the Koreans. And what Westinghouse is trying to do with these lawsuits is come to some settlement, but also effectively block Korean exports of their large reactor technologies anywhere. So it's fairly high stakes. And then the stakes get even higher when you think of geostrategically important places like Saudi Arabia, like Turkey, these markets where these vendors that we've been talking about are also competing against Chinese vendors and Russian vendors, the Russian vendor, I should say. And in those places, Westinghouse blocking the Koreans could potentially have the impact of the reactor deal if it goes forward, going to China or to Russia. So there are big geopolitical stakes to what is going on with what is otherwise a fairly in the weeds IP and export control dispute.
Right, right. I was trying to get a bit of a backgrounder here, and it's interesting just getting a sense of how anemic Westinghouse is compared to its glory days when it was actually building reactors maybe at the pace or faster than the pace of the Koreans. Read they were at 55,000 employees in the 1970s. They're down to about 9,000, kind of stationed in 21 countries around the world. That's of course. I mean, I'm sure the Korean demographics are aging as well, but a lot of the folks that have delivered, have pretty gray hair. So there's some concerns. I mean, we'll get into this later, I'm sure, but there's talk of chorus. I thought that was a really nice little acronym, but Korea and US, some kind of collaboration happening down the road. But for now, there's sounds like a fair amount of animosity. So why don't we do a little history lesson first? And get a sense of where this all originates. What is the actual issue at play? Is it a patent issue? Is it a part of the 123 agreement that Korea signed? Is it something going back to combustion engineering? Phil, fill us in.
Okay, I will go back very far. Um, and I mean, there's multiple places we could start. I would start just very quickly to summarize the South Korean nuclear program going back to the 60s and 70s. Um, the first KEPCO, which is Korea Electric Power Company, their first tender for the first nuclear plant at Kori went out in June 1968 and went out to GE, to Westinghouse, to Combustion Engineering, which was another US based reactor firm, and to what was then the British reactor firm, making, I think, not entirely sure what they were inventing at that point. They did not win it. Westinghouse won that and supplied the very first pressurized water reactor vessel, pressurized water reactor to Kori, which was the first power reactor in Korea. That reactor was recently, within the last 10 years, shut off. Then, over the next 15 years, South Korea they built a couple Canadian reactors, some CANDUs. They built some French reactors. They built a handful more Westinghouse reactors. And in 1985, November of 85, they invited 23 countries to bid on building their 11th and 12th reactors. But what they were looking for here wasn't just a turnkey, give us a reactor, give us a key, we'll turn it on and operate it. They were looking for the technology. They wanted to import the reactor and then ultimately absorb the technology to create their own indigenous domestic program. They were envisioning nuclear as sort of being another major export industry ultimately, like they'd already made shipbuilding, and they were making cars um, and high tech. So that was in the mid 80s. In 85, I now want to switch. In the US. One of the bidders then was Combustion Engineering, and 12 years ago, I talked to Shelby Brewer, who is since deceased, but was the CEO. He started in 1985 of Combustion Engineering. He was a CEO, sorry, of their nuclear division for 10 years. And he had just left as Reagan's nuclear power czar from the first term of the Reagan administration. So he gets to this high profile perch at Combustion Engineering. And what he was looking at is they had not had an order, he said, from maybe 1977. There hadn't been an order in years. And he thought, I'm just going to quote him, what am I supposed to do? Sit here and preside over a dying company? You can't eat the design. We have to bid to get new contracts. Nobody was signing new contracts in the US at this point, partially for the reaction to Three Mile Island, and partially, the China syndrome, but I think more importantly because of these huge cost overruns that were really there were canceled projects. There were just these disastrous construction projects, and suddenly no U.S. utilities wanted nuclear. So to get any contracts, the U.S. Reactor firms had to look outside the U.S. So Shelby Brewer looked to South Korea, and he said, the thing that did the trick with us, with the Koreans, was a very robust and complete technology transfer portion. Um, he said they had wanted to become nuclear independent. He said, I'll go with you one step further than that. We will set you up not only to be nuclear independent from any foreign technology, will position you to be a nuclear exporter in time. And Shelby told me he was actually proud when we spoke 12 years ago. They had won this big export contract to the UAE to build the UAE's first nuclear plant, 4 reactors. And he was proud of that. He saw that as a direct lineage of what he had agreed to do in 1985 when he was actually bidding against Westinghouse. He was also bidding against the French. I'm not entirely sure whoever. I mean, this is very before my time, but combustion engineering won that. What they were supplying to the Koreans was this reactor called the System 80 Plus, which was just a conventional pressurized water reactor. That then became the core of the ongoing South Korean program. And basically, for a decade, all of the reactors that got started in South Korea, which was dramatically ramping up its nuclear capacity, they then rebranded as OPR 1000s, but it was using that combustion engineering technology. Now, the 90s get very confusing with the sort of um, corporate mergers and acquisitions. In 1995, ABB, which is a Swedish industrial firm, bought combustion engineering. And then at the very end of the decade, that nuclear division was sold to BNFL, the British Nuclear Fuels Limited, um, which also at basically the same time bought Westinghouse from CBS, which Westinghouse, the television channel, Westinghouse had bought earlier in the 90s. So then
Sorry, a television channel bought Westinghouse?
no, it was the opposite. Westinghouse, as a big industrial conglomerate, bought, what
Okay.
was the year? I think I noted it here. Earlier in the 90s, Westinghouse bought CVS, and then it became this massive conglomerate. And then the conglomerate decided, actually, nothing's happening with nuclear. We are going to sell this to BNFL. So BNFL then owned both combustion engineering and Westinghouse. And then another 6 years later, it then sold those on to Toshiba for $5.4 billion in February 2006. So then Toshiba owned this US combined firm, and sort of the combustion engineering and Westinghouse offices got pretty merged. And then Toshiba owned this for a decade. Then in 2017, we don't have to go into all of this. Westinghouse had problems with its US new builds. It went bankrupt. And that is when Brookfield, the Canadian private equity firm, came in and bought Westinghouse. But Westinghouse basically has inherited all of the, I mean, it has inherited the company and inherited the intellectual property and inherited all the agreements of combustion engineering. So now we go back to the the relationship between the U.S. nuclear firm, which is now Westinghouse, and the Koreans. It was actually in 1997 that so the Koreans are building all of these OPR 1000s, they called them, um, not far different from the combustion engineering design. In 1997, they signed a 10-year framework agreement with technology transfer framework agreement with what is then combustion engineering, but is soon to become um, ABB's combustion engineering, but is soon to become Westinghouse. And this 10-year agreement um, sort of arranges what it's going to look like if the Koreans ever export. When the Koreans actually then win their first export contract in 2009 with the Emiratis, with Abu Dhabi, then that prompts, so it was a 10-year agreement. So that initial agreement had expired between the Koreans and Westinghouse in 2007. They then signed another 10-year agreement in 2010. And that then enables Westinghouse to have some scope in the in some construction scope, basically reactor coolant pumps and some instrumentation and control technology in the Korean supplied reactors to Abu Dhabi. So that then expires in 2020. And that then sets up what is happening now. So suddenly in 2020, we have this expiring agreement between the two parties. We have new ownership. So we have Brookfield. And then there's this big play for new build contracts in Eastern Europe. So the two big markets, which are still some of the most realistic markets in Europe for new nuclear to happen, were Poland and the Czech Republic. And in October 2020, the U.S. government, as part of this push to compete with the Russian model, where basically you sign bilateral agreements. And then from those bilateral agreements, you ramp up your cooperation at the commercial level, and it will ultimately result in a commercial contract, is the hope. So the US government under Trump and then under Biden has been really pushing this model of starting with government to government agreements and then working towards via financing, via all of these other commercial agreements, working towards a commercial EPC contract and then actually starting construction. So Washington and Warsaw signed this in October 2020, and Washington's frame of mind is we have basically agreed now to be the first supplier of the Polish nuclear program. Um, the Poles don't quite agree with that. When I talked to them at the time, they were like, "Yes, we have the agreement with Washington, but we're also still talking to the French and the Koreans."
And
And that
how formal is this? This isn't the famous Step 1, 2, 3 agreement, or what's the?
so this is different. So there's the nuclear cooperation agreements. This is a um, these are very similar terms but different things. Nuclear cooperation agreements sets up for legal purposes U.S. U.S. cooperation with other countries. Poland, there is a sort of U.S. EU, and these are called 123 agreements, which is after Section 123 of the U.S. Atomic Energy Act of 1954. So those agreements are necessary for any serious nuclear cooperation between the U.S. and any other
And
country.
those are anti-proliferation in
Yeah,
particular,
well, those are
or it's
yes.
broad.
They set up. They really deal with the non-proliferation aspects and all of the export control aspects, and you need that for any U.S. supplier um, to certainly to supply nuclear plants or material. So that is a 123 agreement. Poland basically has that with the US via the EU, has a broad, or I think it might be Euratom, has a broad 123 with the US. So this is not that. This is separate from that. There are these IGAs, intergovernmental agreements, um, on nuclear cooperation, which are much more commercial focused. So and there's even a preceding step to that, which were unveiled under the Trump administration, called the basically like nuclear cooperation MOUs, but still at a government to government level. And the US has rolled those out basically across Eastern Europe. So Poland, Romania to the IGA level, but those MOUs, you're also in Bulgaria, all of these places have been, Washington has been pushing to slowly expand US nuclear presence in that region. So there was a sentiment in both Washington and Pittsburgh, where Westinghouse is based, that Poland is sort of our market now. The Poles kept on talking with the Koreans and the French, and then in October 2022, um, Westinghouse jumps out with this lawsuit against both KEPCO and Korea Hydro Nuclear Power, which is KEPCO's 100% owned subsidiary, and which is the actual operator of all of the South Korea's nuclear plants. And this is where it gets very confusing. Um, Act basically independent of KEPCO as they approach markets. So KEPCO is owned by the South Korean Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy called MOTI, and Moti owns KEPCO. KEPCO owns KHNP. Moti basically has a map of the world where they say these markets are yours, KHNP, these markets are yours, KEPCO. So those two are not competing against each other, but they don't necessarily have 100% aligned interests because they are going for very different markets which have very different needs. So going back to October of
But they're
2022,
both selling nuclear reactors,
they're
or they're?
both selling the same nuclear reactors.
Wow, that's so weird. Okay.
It is a interesting system. So, well, sorry, they are both selling the large nuclear reactors. KHNP has come out with its SMR, the ISMR. I'm not entirely sure to what extent KEPCO is selling that, but Anyways, it's a unique system. Um, the Westinghouse lawsuit in October 2022 came out against both of them. They were both counterparties, and um, Westinghouse basically said, this is October 21st, 2022. Westinghouse has learned that KEPCO is about to enter into a memorandum of intent with a consortium, including the Polish government, to sell APR 1400. Sorry. It also noted that Westinghouse had invited to bid to a Czech new build program and to the Saudi new build program. Then 10 days later, this is where the Polish program gets confusing. Poland has this official program of 3 reactors on the Baltic coast, and that remains Westinghouse, and that has only firmed up that Westinghouse would supply those. But a different parastatal company in Poland, PGE, which was their big utility, teamed up with ZE Pack, this coal company that was majority owned by a Polish telecoms billionaire. They come together and say, we are going to build an inland power plant using APR 1400s from KHNP. And to the US, this was like, you're coming into our territory. What are you doing? We've locked this up, and this isn't even the official program. What on earth is this? So that also helped prompt Westinghouse to launch this lawsuit. The lawsuit then, do you want to quick? I mean, basically, the lawsuit was making 2 key points. The first was that this is Westinghouse owned IP. So
When you say this, that's referring to key, technological elements of the APR 1400, the whole plant. Is this like a valve or something that's in play? Or I'm just trying to get a sense of
yeah.
what
So
the
the
dispute is.
Westinghouse cases, and I'm reading from their lawsuit, among other things, the reactor coolant system, the auxiliary systems that connect the reactor to the reactor vessel, and the systems that control the reactor power, of both the APR 1400 and the APR 1000 are derivative of the licensed technology, which is that combustion engineering
So
technology.
these are not like trivial little things that you could just
These are
engineer in a
these are
week and
core parts of their
yeah.
design, which Westinghouse says are directly go back to the combustion engineering design. So Westinghouse, and it also, sorry, I should just quickly explain. I said the APR 1400, that's what the Koreans, that's the big thing they have been building in South Korea for the past decade. That's also what they exported to the UAE. And then the APR 1000 is almost a rebrand of the OPR 1000, but that is what they were bidding to the Czech Republic, to a couple other markets because it's smaller and it fits the site at Dukovany, the initial Czech new build plant, which has some existing reactors. So, so basically, Westinghouse comes in and says, all of that technology that I just went through, that is our IP, and you need our commercial sign off to be able to export those and build those anywhere. Separately, they said, because this is US origin technology, it is subject to US export controls. And in this case in particular, that means Part 810. And a Part 810 is what the US Department of Energy, it's the authorization they give to unclassified nuclear technology and assistance to foreign atomic energy activities within the US or abroad. That's the sort of official definition that was on their website. So if you are going to, I mean, you can get a Part 810 to actually just consult on a program. You can apply to the DOE and say, we are going to consult with, as a owner's engineer or whatever, on a program, or for an actual reactor supply. And Westinghouse argued, because what the Koreans have is ultimately uses US technology, it needs Part 810 authorizations. And as the owner of that technology, we are the ones who have to apply for that. The Koreans cannot apply for Part 810s to Washington. So that was they then filed this in a court in Washington, D.C. The Korean response was twofold. A, they deny entirely that either of those large reactors have any remaining IP from the combustion engineering days. But they also said, even if it did, like all of our agreements have always said, any dispute over this goes to an arbitration court. So now we have two separate processes. Well, up until a week or two ago, we had two separate processes. We had one, the process going on in the U.S. courts a year after the Westinghouse suit. Then the U.S. court agreed with the Korean position, finding that Westinghouse basically did not have standing on the export control front, because only the U.S. government should have standing to um, to ob- uh, to object to the Koreans exporting that technology to the Czech Republic, to Poland, wherever else. Westinghouse did not have standing, so that was a blow against Westinghouse, which has then appealed the case. They are going to be having a hearing on that soon, on the appeal. Separate from that, there is this ongoing arbitration process at the in Seoul at the Korean Commercial Arbitration Board. And those are very, as with all arbitration processes, very not public. Westinghouse, in its announcement a week ago, said it expects that process to be done no sooner than the second half of 2025.
And do they expect that process to be biased? It's an arbitration court within South Korea, and this is the Koreans' preferred way to na- navigate this dispute, as per what they say the
I don't
agreement
know if
was.
they
Or
expect that. I mean, and I don't know. I do not know much about this arbitration court. I think there is sort of standard norms from arbitration law. I expect will be followed there, but whether or not it's biased, it's what was always agreed to in the contracts. So since the combustion engineering days, they said the arbitration will be there rather than Paris or wherever else. So if it is biased, it's sort of on combustion engineering for agreeing to it. So there's that process, there's the US court process. And then the most recent news is in July, the Czechs awarded KHMP a contract to supply 2 to 4 APR 1000s. Westinghouse had actually not advanced to the last round of bidding on this, because what the Czechs were looking for was a fixed price turnkey contract. They wanted the vendor to take all of the construction risk, which is a complete anathema to Westinghouse and particularly to Brookfield, given Westinghouse's experiences at Vogel and going bankrupt. Um, Westinghouse basically did not submit a bid in the initial bids that was fixed price turnkey as the Czechs had required, and they were not invited to make the final binding offer. They did, and EDF did. KHMP and EDF did. KHMP then won this in July. So this was viewed in Seoul as this is going to save the Korean, what they call it, the Korean nuclear ecosystem. Because these reactor contracts, the actual sort of reactor engineering part is only a small part. You're talking about this massive supply chain going across the Korean nuclear industry that has been struggling. The previous administration was anti-nuclear, did not want any domestic new builds. So the current Korean government embraced this and said, as has KHMP, as this is going to save the Korean nuclear industry. And then Westinghouse came in on I guess last week and said at the very end of August and said, actually, we are complaining about this process to an official Czech process complaint court. Competition authority, it is. Westinghouse said the Koreans didn't have the right to bid because it's we own the IP and it has to go through us, and they did not obtain from us a consent for them to bid. So the Koreans complained. EDF also complained. We're not entirely sure what EDF was complaining about. They've been very vague in their public
the
statements.
French.
But so that is now we have three different processes where Westinghouse is pushing back. Westinghouse and the Koreans are disputing. And this obviously has lots of geopolitical connotations, including just for the bilateral Seoul-Washington relationship. The US is South Korea's closest ally. This is an important issue. It's obviously not the most important issue when you talk about South Korea, given that North Korea is right there, given this whole panoply of other stuff. But it is getting high level attention. I mean, the US government is very, very concerned about this. And actually, at the beginning of August, the MOTI minister plus the heads of KEPCO and KHNP flew over to Washington trying to come to some resolution. They met with Jennifer Granholm, the US Secretary of Energy, head of Westinghouse, Patrick Fragman, also various other senior people in the US government, and they did not make a deal. So we're now at this impasse where the Koreans are negotiating for a final EPC contract with the Czechs. They want to finish that in the first quarter of 2025. You have this arbitration process. You've got two legal processes now, and it's very unclear how this all ultimately ends.
I mean, there's so much to unpack there. You kind of had to deliver that in one big swath of history. I wanted to interrupt you. I did interrupt you too many times, but so many questions come to mind. So hopefully I'll be able to kind of interrogate that in a way that flows. It kind of begs the question: okay, you made these 10-year agreements in the past. Why can't you just do it again? When you said that Westinghouse got some scope in Baraka, this is secondhand information or just word of mouth, but I heard it amounted to something like 2.4 billion in royalties, something like 10% of the contract. Um, Bizarrely, not just for sort of pumps and things like that, but also just translation, like going Korean to English to Arabic. I think was just going straight Korean to Arabic. I think was quite a challenge. Again, that's hearsay, but pretty significant. And other I, like you, attend a lot of these conferences and overhear a lot of things. But I've heard some Westinghouse exec type folks saying, this was the best business we ever had. It was
Absolutely.
low risk, and this is what Brookfield loves, right? Low risk, high reward. So presumably that's maybe what this delegation was going to discuss, or there's some room. I mean, certainly there seems to be a wish on the Koreans' part to move quickly on this if they're trying to negotiate for an EPC in Czechia for early next year. I mean, this has the potential to put the brakes on something that you said again is really important for Korea's export ambitions and its major part of its high tech economy.
Yeah, I mean, so I think if this were just a matter of the Czech Republic, where basically the arrangement is the Koreans are going to supply definitely two reactors at Dukovany and potentially another two reactors at Temelin, the second Czech nuclear site. So it's 2 to 4 reactors. It's a huge, huge contract, comparable to Baraka, to the UAE contract. And if it were just about that project, it might not be that hard to come up to some similar thing where Westinghouse gets some scope, is paid some royalties, has some very good money coming at it for not a lot of risk, sort of, as you said, the model that Brookfield loves. I think one of the broader issues is that you've got it's not just it's not just the Czech Republic. There's Poland. There's all of these other possible markets, and what Westinghouse wants to see is a global settlement that will settle this issue, um, presumably for as long as they can keep it settled. And I guess there's three things. You talked about royalties, which is a key one. There's scope, and then there's the ability to say yes or no to competing in a market. So Westinghouse would like all three of those things. But particularly that last one is a very hard pill to swallow for the Czechs. Because if they are going up against Westinghouse in Turkey, let's say, or Poland, Westinghouse basically wants the ability to say, no, we are in this market. You stay out of this market. Some other big markets coming up are Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands. Um, and so it would be a very hard pill for the Koreans to swallow to say, oh, yeah, yeah, we'll just run everything by you. Um, the other issue is the Koreans, it's very unclear how they are going to afford this fixed price turnkey contract. It's very hard.
Okay, did that used to be pretty standard that you'd have these fixed price contracts, and then that went out the window with the big blowouts? I mean, there's been blowouts since forever, it seems, but was that a more standard way to sort of sell nuclear exports in
I
the
think it was. I
past?
mean, again, the 60s and 70s were before my time. I think there was a lot more of that stuff. I'm pretty sure that um, the initial Westinghouse reactor, Corey 1 to South Korea, was a fixed price turnkey. Um, but in sort of the modern era, the most famous example of this has been Olkiluoto 3, the
Yeah.
Finnish project, where Arriva, which is now it's the reactor division, has now become EDF. Arriva went in. They had developed with the Germans, with Siemens, this EPR, which at the time was called the European Pressurized Reactor, and they needed a first of a kind client, and they really believed in technology, and they very bullishly said, "We're going to give you for one fixed price, we will take all of the construction risk, and we will build this first of a kind EPR at Okoloto." TVA was the utility, and that obviously went disastrously. Almost, I mean, almost more disastrous than what happened to Westinghouse. The reason Arriva has the reactor division was dismantled and given to EDF was because they basically went bankrupt, um, not formally, and they were a state-owned company, so the government basically dismembered them. But that was in large part. There were some other problems on the uranium side. They were just hemorrhaging money on that project, trying to build it. So with that model, it's not super tempting, particularly if you're not a state-owned company, to ever agree to a fixed price turnkey contract. But it's very enticing from the customer side because, given what construction disasters most non-Chinese new builds are, um, you want to limit them that as much as possible. So if it ever happens, what the Czechs are being promised by the Koreans is great, but can the Koreans really afford that? And and potentially it's even a loss leader, depending how things develop. A loss leader that's reviving their domestic supply chain, so maybe worth it. But it becomes even more of a loss leader if they have to pay massive royalties to Westinghouse. And would they agree to pay massive royalties to Westinghouse in the Czech Republic and all future projects and give Westinghouse a veto and give Westinghouse supply chains so that there's less business to South Korea? Who knows?
So, like, how much can you read in Westinghouse being majority owned by a private equity firm into the aggressiveness here? You mentioned there's a lot of tensions going on, right? There's the kind of profit motive of the company, but this is also interacting with U.S. government agreements, global sort of geostrategy in a rapidly multipolarizing world, and there's a lot going on there. So I'm just wondering if you can comment though on Westinghouse has changed hands so many times. The British to the Japanese to the Canadians to Canadians and Cameco. I mean, it could well be sold again. I've heard rumors that maybe this is a way to inflate the value of Westinghouse before Brookfield finally offloads it and turns a hefty profit. This is all speculation, but I'm just curious in terms of current ownership, if to what degree that might be driving the aggressiveness of these lawsuits, or if this would just be par for the course, regardless of ownership.
Yeah, I mean the short answer is I have no idea. Brookfield as a private equity firm is is not out there talking to journalists or anything, or at least not to me. I assume they are very involved in this strategy. They've had a fairly hands-on approach with Westinghouse. The main business, the main revenues they have pumped out of Westinghouse until now have not been at all from the new build side. They've been from its fuel services side and from so it's just supplying fuel assemblies and from its services side. So you know, helping do maintenance and do outages and things like that at nuclear plants and some supply chain stuff. As you noted, Westinghouse is not a massive firm. They don't have tons of supply chain, but they've got the engineers and they've got that nuclear expertise. Um, and that business, Brookfield has made very profitable. What does it want on the new build business? It would love to get some of these Eastern European projects off the ground. So there's the three I mentioned in Poland. There's another two theoretically at Kozloduy, this Bulgarian plant, and then there's a very sort of notional deal to supply 9 AP1000s to Ukraine. Obviously, after the war, um, if the war goes in the a certain direction, it is possible that there might be a huge amount of post-war funding, reconstruction funding flowing in, and potentially that could go to build some of these. So that's a sort of very long-term notional thing, but that's a fair amount of potential business they have lined up. What is still unclear is how any of those projects will be financed and will get off the ground, particularly given that and sort of what a contract would look like, given that Westinghouse, as we've discussed, will not be supplying them a fixed price turnkey, will not be taking on that construction risk. Um, it's a heavy lift for any of those projects to come to fruition. But if they do, and if Westinghouse gets them with a cost plus contract or something, it could be very profitable. As you said, like the Baraka scope for Westinghouse was probably their most profitable new build business, um, maybe outside of China. Certainly more profitable than the U.S. actual AP1000s that Westinghouse supplied. The four of them, or two that were completed, two that were not completed, all of which made Westinghouse go bankrupt. Certainly not profitable. It was hemorrhaging money on those contracts, but in the UAE, it made good money. So you can sort of see Brookfield or whoever, the decision makers of Westinghouse now have made this calculation. Look, this lawsuit, we can like elbow the Koreans out of the way, um, may or may not work. And it either, and potentially, it will give us a lot of scope, a lot of royalties, a lot of profits from Korean export contracts. And potentially, it will keep them out of the markets that we want to somehow lock in. Um, but if it really does elbow at the Koreans, elbow out of both Poland and potentially the Czech Republic, it's not clear anyone else is going to swoop in. Like for the Czech Republic, Westinghouse, as we said, didn't make it to the second round of bidding because they will not offer a fixed price turnkey. Whatever EDF offered, presumably, is much more expensive and, given their track record, not particularly commercially attractive. So then, what are the Czechs left with if the Koreans are unable to supply? Very little. Um, and then that sort of equation then gets us to Saudi Arabia or Turkey, where if it elbows out the Koreans, but then is unable to offer its own very attractive commercial offering, then markets that are receptive to the Chinese, to the Russians, they might just go that way, and that ultimately is Brookfield and Westinghouse playing a game of chicken that ultimately um, acts against Washington's interest, which maybe is fine if you're a private equity guy. But Washington, I think, is probably pretty nervous about this. The U.S. government, I mean.
And so again, it's not Ottawa here. Westinghouse is Canadian owned, but this being U.S. origin technology and some of the agreements being U.S. government related. There's no role for Ottawa to be involved in this. Just to, as you know, clear the air from a Canadian perspective.
Not that I
I'm trying to get
know
a sense of,
of.
yeah,
Yeah.
that degree of sort of it's a Canadian company now, right? So like, where's the Canadian ambassador in the Polish builds, or don't we get a symbolic piece at the table here?
Well, I mean, you make a good point, as you have made a lot of point of. Westinghouse is out competing for business in Ontario, saying, "Oh, but we're also a Canadian company now." But here, the whole the whole support structure that they are getting on these in this dispute is from the U.S. government because they are a U.S. based company. But yeah, they sort of. I mean, even if they are a U.S. based company, they don't bring a huge U.S. supply chain. So a lot of the supply chain for AP1000s actually comes from Korea. You have
Let's
got
talk about that. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you've got the Doosan constructed the reactor pressure vessels for the U.S. AP1000s. I think some of the initial Chinese AP1000s. Um, and there is a lot of supply chain. There's also Bulgaria, which I was talking about, with these two AP1000s at Kozloduy. The Bulgarians separately bid for an EPC, which is the engineering, procurement, and construction firm that basically actually manages the project, does the project. And Westinghouse is not an EPC, confusingly. So in Poland, Westinghouse had teamed with Bechtel, and when they were bidding in Czech Republic, they had teamed with Bechtel. Bechtel is this massive private U.S. construction firm. Bechtel is also the company that finished up Vogel, with Westinghouse then as a subcontractor to Bechtel. I guess more accurately, the owner of Vogel, Southern Company, finished it up with Bechtel as a contractor and Westinghouse as a subcontractor. Um, but in Bulgaria, the Bulgarians bid it, and Bechtel lost, and it's actually Hyundai, E&C, the Koreans again, one of their chaebol, that if that project gets off the ground, will be actually managing the project. So there's a lot of very sort of existing cooperation on both AP1000s and the Korean APR 1000s or APR 1400s. Um, those projects are very US and very Korean. And that's part of why this dispute is so sort of mind blowing.
Right, right, right. So, I mean, just looking at this, from a really abstract sense, you have Westinghouse, who've put a lot of money and resources into designing, a really modern premier reactor, the AP1000. You have the Koreans, who are one of the few countries that maybe demonstrate a slight positive learning curve in their nuclear buildouts. Probably depending a little bit how you plot the numbers, but certainly fairly flat compared to some of the negative learning rates that have come to be such a common sight in graphs of Western nuclear programs. Like it seems like this kind of potential match made in heaven, as you're describing in Bulgaria. Maybe the Koreans serving as EPCs on AP1000 projects. That being said, I mean, the Koreans have put a lot of time into indigenizing, maybe with air quotes, a significant amount of that combustion engineering model, and have a lot of interest in, you know, being a nuclear exporter independently of the U.S. and having their own design they can put out there in the world. Like, do you envision a world where there is that sort of cooperation based upon, okay, let's lean on the construction strengths of South Korea and the design strengths of Westinghouse and just build AP1000s with Korean EPC?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think there could be that world, and
If
much
if
depend.
Korea if KHNP buys Westinghouse.
I mean, I wrote stories at the time. Why are the Koreans? I mean, I don't think there was ever serious Korean interest, but in 2017, when Westinghouse went bankrupt, it did seem like an easy Korean option would be to buy it at the time, because then all of this would be moot, and then they could just push forward with AP1000s or APR 1400s, with the sort of combined supply chains and combined offices. But that did not happen. I Who knows? Maybe Brookfield will just sell to the Koreans, and this is a crazy bargaining move to get there. I have certainly not heard anything like that, but it's not beyond the realm of possibilities. Um, I guess there are multiple different ways this could play out. It is very possible they come up with some sort of global solution, which maybe sort of delineates a bit which markets, Koreans get out of Poland. Um, Give us some scope in Czech Republic. We'll give you some scope in some AP1000s in Poland. We'll just like swap scope in our various things, which is already a thing. Um, Part of the problem is the actors. So the commercial actors here are KHMP and KEPCO on the Korean side. They are not the rest of the Korean nuclear ecosystem. So Doosan is a private chaebol, as is Hyundai, and it's not clear exactly why giving those folks scope might benefit KEPCO and KHMP, but the Korean government, MOTI, might say, actually, we love that because ultimately our mandate isn't just exporting Korean reactors, it's the Korean supply chain. All of that private business helps Korea's nuclear industry, even if it would be AP1000s. So, yeah, it's possible that they come to some framework solution either through negotiations or in the arbitration court or in the arbitration process next year. Um, and I guess there are still these wild cards, the arbitration process, and then the U.S. legal process. I mean, right now it looks like if the initial court ruling against Westinghouse is any indication, Westinghouse doesn't have a great case. And if Westinghouse doesn't have standing and the higher courts in the US agree with that, then we'll come to the position of the US government. Because the US government has actually not taken any public official positions on any of this. Despite my multiple requests for comment, they give fairly anodyne statements, but they obviously have a lot of different conflicting concerns here, as we've been over. And at some point, the US government may have to step in and say, yes, we think that the Koreans have to apply to us for export controls or not. I should also say, as part of the when Westinghouse initially filed against the Koreans in October of 2022, the Koreans very quickly and independently applied for Part A10 authorizations independently. Um, and KHMP did this and said that they do not concede that this is US IP, but just to sort of tick all boxes, and so we will gracefully yet let you give us export control authorization. So they did that without Westinghouse, to try to say, look, we can just do this independently without Westinghouse doing it. And we still have yet to hear what the US DOE will ultimately make of a request like that.
Getting to that question of indigenizing technology, um, unless I misunderstood, I think that the Koreans have the right to deploy uh, combustion engineering derivative technology domestically. But
Absolutely.
what's that question here is the international exports. Um, like, how many changes do you need to make for something to be considered indigenized or no longer derivative? Like, is that something they're claiming to have done? Do you know what the bar is for that? Is that a really complex engineering question
I
that's
think I
beyond
think it's
both of
not
us?
just a complex engineering question; it's a complex legal question, and it's one that, um, particularly with some, was with multi-thousand-page reactor designs. I I don't think there is a simple answer. I mean, I think even when even when these companies were agreeing, even when they were agreeing on this 1997 and 2010 agreements, there were teams of lawyers and engineers on either side pouring through this stuff, trying to agree on that. So I certainly think there's no easy answer. If there is an easy answer, I'm not the person to give it. I am not an engineer or a lawyer. Um, but but yeah, I there is a there is a broader thing here, which is that this dispute, I mean, or just technology transfer, is sort of how the global nuclear industry has been developed, and particularly just from Westinghouse. Like Westinghouse transferred its technology in the 70s to the French, and to the Germans,
And they're allowed
and
to export. They're allowed to export
they are
Westinghouse
allowed to
derivative
export. And basically, that was conceded in the early 80s. I think they
because they
paid
said
some
we're
limited
gonna build like
royalties.
30 or 40 of these reactors, so we're gonna get a sweetheart deal and get the full transfer, I guess.
Right. So the French got the full transfer. I think the Germans got the full transfer, and they were paying royalties for a bit. But then there's certainly no talk of, because ultimately the French EPR is coming from that German and French technology, which ultimately was initially purchased from Westinghouse decades before. There's no talk of Westinghouse pushing its IP rights on that technology. Um, the big looming elephant here is China, because Westinghouse. So let's go back to the aughts. Westinghouse is sold to Toshiba in February 2006. December 2006, Westinghouse beats out the French and the Russians to supply what is meant to be the, the big, large pressurized water reactor of China's future. China is going to build its whole fleet. And at the end of 2006, it selects Westinghouse. It selects the AP1000, and it's going to start with four of them. Um, but it sets up this whole company, SMPTC, State Nuclear Power Technology Company, to not only to sort of interface with Westinghouse, but ultimately to get the technology transfer. So that then we saw those four AP1000s built. There were some problems with reactor coolant pumps, but we saw those four AP1000s built, two of them at Sanmen and two of them at Haiyang in Shandong. And we saw those built. There was a bit of a pause while Beijing digested what the problems that had happened, what waited for some operational feedback. But now we have seen China really greenlight a whole bunch more of these, now rebranded as the CAP 1000s. And they are building those all over China. Separately, SMPTC then designed the CAP 1400, basically just upscaled the AP 1000. And there are two of those under construction, but they are also talking with, nominally with South Africa, most importantly and most realistically with Turkey, to supply these to what would be Turkey's probably third large nuclear plant, multi-reactor nuclear plant. And and if the Chinese ever really, I mean, China has really struggled building up a nuclear export industry in terms of reactors. It's only succeeded in Pakistan. But if China somehow did succeed and really build this up, they are, we know they can build these things really cheap, particularly the CAP 1000s. And right now, they agree with Westinghouse, and Westinghouse doesn't seem to be too worried. But everyone who looks closely at China says this could be a looming issue. And then you would get the prospect of, if China started to try to export CAP 1000s or CAP 1400s without Westinghouse approval, then you could get these huge showdowns, but because they are, I mean, the US and China are obviously not the allies that the US and South Korea are. And who really knows where that could end up. But that is sort of looming on the horizon as one possible place this could all go.
Right. And Turkey just applied for BRICS Plus membership this morning. I think that's kind of one of the breaking news bits of the day. Yeah, that's wild. That makes this whole thing look like a pony show. And so again, so the Chinese, just to be clear, they have domestic deployment rights based on the agreement they signed with Westinghouse for those initial AP1000s. But again, similar situation. If they want
Similar
to deploy
situation. I should
internationally.
also share with China that the sort of, as there were these problems with the initial AP1000s, the first four that Westinghouse took its while supplying, um, the Chinese then developed their own technology called the Hualong One, similar size, also 1,000 megawatts, 1,100 megawatts. Um, and that one has been, it's very confusing, was developed by two competing Chinese state-owned firms, CGN and CNNC. Um, and then there's like a merged version. There is also a case where that technology, ultimately, if you go pull back on it, goes back to the M310 reactors that Framatome, that the French exported to China. So the Chinese are really building those Hualong ones even faster than those CAP 1000s. And there's potentially, if they started to, I mean, they have exported these to Pakistan. If they started going to other countries, there potentially could be a French argument that they are violating French IP rights, but we have not seen that. But again, we haven't seen any serious Chinese exports, particularly in the last 6 years since there was a sort of a bigger schism between Beijing and the West. So that's another thing to
So it seems like a perfect opportunity for the Canadians just to sneak right in there with their fully indigenized can-do reactor. No,
I mean,
no
the problem with
derivative.
any exporter when you're exporting these projects to any country, particularly if they're building fleet size, is but even if they're just building one reactor, every country, when they're selecting, this is going to be a massive mega project, and the company not only wants domestic supply chain, but they want technology transfer. And um, the Canadians have faced this too. Like the what the Argentines built, the Can Do. Um, they did get domestic rights to that. So when there has been talk of building another Candu, theoretically, the Argentinians can just build it entirely themselves. But then the Canadians and now Israelis can say, okay, you can build the Candu 6 from whenever, 20 years ago you ordered it. um, we can build that design. But if you want to include any of the upgrades and post Fukushima changes that we have made to the design subsequently, then hello, we've got to be in the room. So Canada's been pretty good at getting that business, particularly refurbishments. And when there is some talk of, finishing to Candu reactors in Romania, Candu is going to get Candu Energy, owned by Israelis, is going to get a big chunk of business out of that. But it faces all the exact same issues. We just haven't seen any country build Candus and then try to export them other than Canada.
I mean, I guess the Indians have built them, but they
Yeah,
haven't
and the
moved
Indians
to
have
export. Yeah.
have murmured about that over the years, but I think they're pretty distracted. I don't think they're going to be exporting reactors anytime.
Right, right. Okay, so I guess kind of wrapping this up and bringing it back to just to sort of global outlook where we stand right now. I mean, every moment in history is kind of a unique one, but this is an interesting one again, where we have um, again. I'm always a little bit suspect of climate ambitions in particular not being as pragmatic as energy security ones, but we have commitments to dramatically increase the deployment of nuclear energy across the world. Again, those announcements at COP, there wasn't a huge participation from Russia and China, I think, because there was a big move to try and get the World Bank to fund and get back into this, and that would actually hurt the Russians and Chinese. Was kind of some of what I heard about why they were not so active in the declaration. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of interest now. Beyond climate, there's some energy security, pragmatic questions, particularly in Eastern Europe. Um, what do you sort of foresee going forward? Do you think this is going to throw a major wrench in this? I read it, reading in the Energy Intelligencer, there was maybe just some saber rattling by the Czechs saying, "Hey, if this all falls through, then there's a minority of folks here in Czechia that are actually kind of sympathetic with Moscow, and we might go the Russian route." What do you think this means? I guess for kind of Western aspirations for building nuclear independent of the Russians and Chinese.
I guess what I would say is probably what this means, and this could go lots of different ways with all of these different arbitration and legal cases. But I think the big thing is the next couple of years, this is just going to delay everything. Basically, for all of these Western programs that are not asking um, for Chinese or Russian reactors. So the Czechs ruled that out for security purposes, as will basically any outside of Hungary, any European country is not going to be soliciting bids from China and Russia. And Europe has a lot of new build plans right now, and for any of them to go forward while this is still up in the air, it just seems like it won't happen. So I think if we're looking at a resolution to the arbitration case at the end of next year, we might be looking at till then for real technology selection decisions to be made. The Koreans have told the Czechs that they will indemnify them from any of the results of this process. I'm not entirely sure what that would look like. If this process dragged on for several years, would they really pour the concrete on these reactors? If suddenly Washington might go crazy, I don't know. And what would an indemnification look like? I don't know. The other question is then what happens in these other markets? We're not just talking Turkey, Saudi Arabia, potentially South Africa. Um, there's also the UAE. They are now talking about a second full set of 4 new reactors. And if they go forward with that, they will most likely have that open to everybody because they want to see the commercial bids come in from the Chinese and the Russians and obviously the Koreans. And and what would this mean for them? I mean, the one saving grace potentially is all of these delays don't ultimately matter because getting a large scale nuclear project off the ground goes at a slug's pace. So if it's, 2 or 3 years before there's a resolution here, it might not make a huge difference on any of these projects, but it's certainly not going to speed them up. And yeah.
All right, so maybe a bit of an opening for the French if the Koreans and the uncompetitive French with the Koreans and the Americans tied up, and again for Team Canada there. Um, I've become such a flag waving
Canadian
Canuck.
nationalist.
Oh God, it's obnoxious. All right, I think that's a good place to end it. Phil, this is super illuminating. You know your you've been at this a long time, and I really hope to have you back again soon. I don't know what's taken 3+ years to get you on, but might be
Yeah, I would love to
it's
talk whenever. It's been a
for
pleasure.
sure,
Thanks so much,
for
Chris.
sure, absolutely. Okay, until next time.